The next issue on our list of complexities for equality is that there is often more than one way to compare values of a given type. String is probably the best example of this. Suppose I have two strings that both contain the phrase apple pie. Should you consider those strings to be equal? I'm sure you'll agree that since those two strings contain exactly the same characters, then it makes sense to consider them equal. And indeed, that is what C# does. But what if I make one of them title case? Now should those strings be considered equal? In fact, in C#, the equality operator will say they are not equal. But if we are asking not about the C# equality operator, but about whether in principle we should consider those strings as equal, then we can't really answer. It completely depends on the context whether or not you should ignore the case. If, say, I have a database of recipes, and I'm using the string apple pie to query the recipe for apple pie in the database, then the chances are I want to ignore the case and treat both of the strings as equal to each other. But if the context is that apple pie in title case has been typed in as the password by a user trying to log into a website, and you're checking whether the password is correct, then you should certainly not consider the lowercase and title case strings to be equal. For strings, by the way, the equality operator is always case sensitive, so you can't use it to do comparisons that ignore the case. If you want to ignore the case, you can do, but only by calling special methods that are specific to strings and which we'll look at later in this course. Now, I'm sure that none of that will surprise you. Case sensitivity for strings is an issue that almost everyone encounters very early on when programming. But this illustrates a wider point that equality isn't really an absolute in programming. Rather, the meaning of equality is in general context sensitive. And case sensitivity is simply the most well-known example of that. I'll just mention two more examples of context sensitivity. Going back to strings and our recipe database example, should you ignore excess white space? If someone types in the phrase apple pie with 2 spaces between the words instead of 1 when they're trying to look up a recipe, and you want to present a good experience to the user, then you may well want to ignore these extra spaces, because the user probably didn't even notice he or she typed them in. So in principle, how you deal with white space when evaluating string equality is another example of something that can be context sensitive. Now here's a different example. Here are 2 database records. Are they equal? In one sense, yes. Obviously these are the same record. They're referring to the same foodstuff, and they have the same primary key. But their values are different. Clearly one of these data items refers to a record after it was updated. So this illustrates another conceptual issue with equality that comes into play when you are updating data. Do you care about the precise values of a record, or do you care only whether it's the same record? And clearly there's no one right answer to that. Once again, it depends on the context, what you are trying to do.